Rowan and Yechiel for inviting me. My aim is to speak for 20 minutes and engage with you in a discussion for 5, because I really wanted to brainstorm with you. What I'm presenting is a work in progress. I'm still thinking about these issues. And I'm not really from Canada. I'm from Jerusalem. So but I will present in English because I was told. I would like to focus on genetic information that we obtain on a fetus, but in the context of what happens when we have a baby, and then a child, and then a person. I've been thinking about a new technology for prenatal testing, NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, for about a decade now. And I'm leading a national Canadian study that looks at the ethical, social, and legal implications of this technology since 2013-14. There are many publications that came out of this study, but what I'm presenting today is really a new area that we started thinking about more recently. What is non-invasive prenatal testing? I'm not going to make any assumptions. Who knows the technology? Great. Luckily, I made like 2 slides to speak about it very briefly. So of course it tests cell-free fetal DNA that floats in maternal plasma. We all carry in our blood cell-free DNA, but when you get pregnant at about 10 weeks of gestation, around 10 to 15% of those fragments of DNA in your blood comes from the placenta. And by testing them, you can get genetic information about the fetus. And all this clears from the blood right after birth to ensure that what you're testing is the current pregnancy. So this is a biology's gift to women that allows them, for the first time, access to quite reliable genetic information about the fetus without invading the uterus or the placenta, which has always entailed a certain risk of miscarriage. So what makes NIPT unique? It's easy, it's just a blood test. It's safe, no associated risk of pregnancy loss compared with invasive tests. It can be done very early, week 9 or 10 of the pregnancy. Just a reminder that amniocentesis can only be done starting week 15. In a pregnancy, every week counts if you're going to be making a decision about termination. It's still considered a screening test, but it's very reliable. So for certain conditions, such as trisomy 21, Down syndrome, specificity and sensitivity are way over 99%. So some have called it already quasi-diagnostic, and for certain conditions, it is diagnostic already. Another unique aspect is that right from the beginning, 2011, it has been offered in a commercial context. So it was introduced into the market by private companies. Women paid for it. The initial cost was about $2,500. It came down to $600 more recently, and even less. And more governments are picking up this technology and inserting it into universal healthcare. Sala Briut would be here. But it's still available privately in almost every country that covers it publicly. So women have access to it. For example, if your country only covers it for women with high risk for a certain condition and you want to buy more, you have access to this in the commercial context. And the expansion of the technology. When it was first offered, it only covered a handful of conditions, and it's now including more and more. What can we currently test for? Fetal sex. Well, think about it. If you're a woman and there are fragments of Y chromosome in your blood, it's obviously not from you in most cases. Blood type, the most common trisomies, 21, 13, 18, other trisomies, sex chromosome abnormalities, some single gene disorders, microdeletions, but technically, and this is where my talk is going, whole genome sequencing of the fetus based on this technology that is risk-free for the pregnancy. So let that sink in for a minute. First trimester, very actionable. By actionable, of course, we mean traditionally information that we can more easily make decisions with. No risk, whole genome. To me, just saying these elements in combination and the ethics was already exploding in my head. And we have known this at a proof of principle level for almost a decade, that this technology would allow whole genome. And yet we've been very busy, the bioethicists, thinking and discussing the more immediate uses of the technology. And I think we haven't paid enough attention to what's coming. When we talk about invasive testing, CVS, amniocentesis, it has traditionally only been carried out for conditions that were seen socially as severe enough to justify the risk of miscarriage. But the risk-free nature of NIPT and the ability to test earlier means that we may gradually lower the threshold of what we see as appropriate testing. So individuals may wish to test for less severe conditions or ones that are treatable, late onset adult diseases, not something that will appear in childhood, non-medical information such as sex and paternity. We actually ran a survey in Canada and many women are interested in using NIPT for paternity testing, which is intriguing. And at some point maybe physical or even cognitive behavioral traits. So sort of the sky's the limit when it comes to this technology. What does the future hold then? And I'm putting my sociologist hat for a second, even though I wasn't trained in one, and I'm thinking about what ultrasound did to pregnancy and how we all now expect it. Most of us, when we go for an ultrasound, we forgot that it's a diagnostic test and we're going for the fun of seeing the baby, for the prints that we'll get to put on our fridge with a magnet or send our friends, right? This is our introduction to our baby. And this is now even more present with 3D ultrasound, where you actually see your baby suck a thumb or yawn, and I have little movies of my babies in utero, and I felt like that was the first time I saw them when they came out. I felt like I've seen them already. So this is what ultrasound did socially to our sort of culture of pregnancy. What will whole genome NIPT do to the way we perceive our pregnancies and our relationships with the fetus? So my thinking was that if ultrasound made the uterus transparent, NIPT will make the fetus transparent. That we will come to expect, just like we expect to see the baby in the uterus today, that we'll come to expect to see inside the fetus very early on in the pregnancy. That maybe by the time my children have children, it will be obvious to them that by week 11, you just look through the genome of your fetus and make decisions, consider some things, maybe prepare for some things that the genome will tell you. But what seems to us borderline science fiction, and I'm thinking here about the movie Gattaca, who's seen it? What has been portrayed in science fiction is actually already here, but it will just take our culture a few years to get used to its presence and what it means, but that this will shift the way we see pregnancy. Oh, wait, I went the wrong way. So this is where I'm launching into my more novel reflections on the topic. When I look at about a decade of bioethics writing on NIPT, I see that most of the concerns we've been addressing were focused on testing as what critics have called a search and destroy mission. So this was based on the assumption that we test to make a decision about terminating the pregnancy. And indeed, if you look at Down syndrome, the vast majority of parents with a diagnosed pregnancy will terminate. But the framing of prenatal testing as designed to allow women to terminate made us focus on concerns that emerged from the routinization of the technology. So on an individual level, we were afraid that because there's no risk of miscarriage, consent, counseling will be eroded, even disappear. We were afraid that women will feel more pressure to test and maybe even terminate because the technology is so easy, safe, it gets cheaper, there's no risk. On a societal level, this made us worry that more terminations will decrease the population of people living with the condition. which will be a threat to diversity, to disability rights, increase the stigma and discrimination or eugenic tendencies in society, because people who will have a child with a medical problem or special needs, society will point a finger at them and say, why didn't you test? Why is this child even here? Why do we have as a society to carry the burden and the cost of caring for a child that you could have detected in a way that he wouldn't even show up? So sort of a threshold of acceptance to human society created by this technology. These are all very serious ethical concerns, and they have taken up most of the attention of bioethicists. But at the same time, we tell ourselves that prenatal testing is not about termination. It's not a search and destroy mission. It's about informed choice, right? We don't like to be explicit about the rationale of sort of putting pressure on women to terminate certain pregnancies. So we say, no, we give them information so that they can make informed choices about their pregnancies. And if that is indeed the rationale behind prenatal testing, then preparing for the birth of your child is as good a reason and as deciding why you want to terminate a pregnancy. So my claim is that if we're honestly thinking that prenatal testing is about informed choice, then many people might want to test, even run whole genome sequencing on their fetus, not in order to make a decision about an abortion, but rather in order to know more information as they prepare for the birth of their child. And yet, issues related to post-birth challenges that emerge from this have been addressed only marginally in bioethics literature. If I compare the number of articles on the previous screen concerns about pressure to test and consent and disability rights to papers on this topic, there are hardly any. So what happens if, just imagine with me now that I bought from a private company the whole genome of my fetus, and now my baby's born. And I have this information. And it can include some mutations that cause disease, some mutations that cause increased risk for certain diseases, some of them later in life, and some non-medical information. And I now, as the mother, hold all this information. And I was intrigued when Eric talked about the social contract, because my baby never consented to this and didn't exist at the time that we as a society agreed that this arrangement is fine. But this baby is born already sequenced. So what issues can emerge from this? Privacy, of course. The famous right to an open future that bioethicists are applying in various contexts. So the idea that children have the right to keep their future open so that parents are not allowed or should not make certain decisions for them during childhood, because these decisions will belong to them when they become adult. The right not to know genetic information, which we've acknowledged again in other contexts. Consent, which they never provided, these sequenced children. And potential harms. At the family level, there's some writing on, if I know that my son is sitting here, that he has a certain mutation that means that he will have, I'm now playing, learning disabilities, but I have another child who doesn't, maybe I'll choose to pay tuition for the other child to go to get very expensive education rather to the one that has less of a chance of graduating. So how will this type of information play into family dynamics and potential preferential treatment of children, but also, of course, at the societal level, how this will contribute to possible discrimination. So the risks are real, the issues are real, and we haven't really thought through them. But we have thought through other areas that we might look at for inspiration. We did look extensively at genetic testing of children and minors. There's a lot of ethical analysis and professional guidelines telling us actually for many years now that we should not test children, genetically test children, unless it's for childhood diseases that we can do something about, unless the information is actionable. and that parents should not be allowed to test their children for diseases that will arrive later in life, or for risks, or for curiosity. We have been, as genetic counselors, geneticists, have been guided by their professional societies not to allow this. Another area that we can look at, although I have to say in recent years these professional guidelines are relaxing a little bit, and the types of tests that are now considered to be appropriate are increasing. We can also look at newborn screening that are government-run programs, which have received much ethical and legal scrutiny. So in most countries, babies at birth, a drop of blood is taken from them, and a certain number of conditions are tested. It started with a disease that if you change the baby's nutrition right from the beginning, a terrible disease that you could completely prevent by a nutritional change. So that seemed so justified that it was done without parental consent. So nobody asked the parents, do you allow us, the government, to test your newborn? Everybody got tested. But that opened the door to a mechanism, then many other conditions were added on with less and less justification, but the mechanism was already there, and even to this day, in most countries, parents do not give consent to this type of testing.
They can refuse if there's an opt-out.
They can refuse if they know it's happening, and most of the time they don't. Plus, they just gave birth, so they have other things on their mind. So the debate has been, the ethical and legal debate has been, is what is justified to include in these government-run programs that could override the need for parental consent. But interestingly, a very recent project, BabySec, is considering the possibility of running whole genome sequencing on newborns. Not looking for specific conditions because of actionability or family risk, but just sequencing the whole genome of every newborn and seeing how this can improve the clinical care of children and individuals. So this is done as a clinical trial, and only certain results are disclosed to the parents, but we're already thinking about a future in which every baby will be fully sequenced and what this would mean for the healthcare system and for society. It's not a concept, it's being done right now. It's being tested right now. But NIPW, the whole genome through, in a prenatal context, I'd like to argue is different than the issue of testing children or the issue of newborn screening. And I have at least 3 points. First of all, when you're testing a fetus and not a child, you're dangerously linking into the issue of the moral status of the fetus and into the abortion debate. So if I start making arguments in my papers about, hey, we shouldn't allow parents to test whatever they want, even though it's just a fetus, because this will become a child and there will be privacy issues, this can too quickly transform into she's giving some legal status to the fetus, and hence the fetus would deserve other protections from parental decisions, and this, especially in the US context, would quickly derail into the abortion debate. Another issue is that the reasons for testing may be unclear even to the parents. They may think they're testing for curiosity or for preparation and then find out something that will make them decide to terminate, or vice versa. So telling parents you're not allowed to test whatever you want in your fetus because you shouldn't know it after birth is problematic when they might use this information to terminate, which they're allowed to do. So that blurs the lines around parental motivation. And finally, the commercial context. Newborn screening programs are government run. Here, we're talking about a private offer that it's much harder to limit the market than it is to limit government programs. We're talking about a for-profit drive of companies to offer bigger packages. The more is tested, the more it's going to cost, the more money they're going to make. And of course, if one country decides to limit, parents can travel to another one. So we have another kind of reproductive prenatal tourism. Actually, India, for example, banned fetal sex determination. So what's happening today is that these private companies are sending a nurse to your home in India. They take your blood and they just ship it elsewhere to another country where the testing is done, and then you can get it through a secure website or phone call. So What does it even mean to try and legislate this in a world where borders hardly exist anymore? So my final point is that we need a clear conceptual approach to this. And I'm going to offer you a spectrum. On one extreme, we can just prioritize privacy or the open future of the prospective child and completely ban this use of the technology. On the other extreme, we can prioritize parental autonomy and say we allow unrestricted testing and unrestricted use of the information post-birth. There are also normative arguments in the literature that say we don't have a right to an open future, we don't have a right not to know. Genetic information should be a part of every person's self-knowledge. I'm thinking about the knowing more about ourselves. We should know this, we don't have a right not to know, which also leads to less restrictions on NIPW. We can say, okay, parents can test the fetus for whatever they want, but post-birth, we need to limit the way they use the information. Maybe we take it away from them. Maybe we intervene into family dynamics and make sure that they don't use it in ways that harm the child. Very problematic. Or we can adopt a nuanced approach based on the type of information. So say, maybe not whole genome, but extensive parental freedom with some limitations depending on what type of information you want to get.
Censor bits of the genome?
Censor bits of the genome to protect prospective children,
So,
but
is open, but eye color is adapted.
in a minimalistic way that would limit parents in a justified way. So this would be, of course, the direction that I think we should go, but it's highly controversial, highly complex, and requires much more thinking, which I hope my team will do in coming years. My sort of concluding remark is that if we move into a future where many babies are born already sequenced prenatally, we must, much genetic information will be available on individuals who never consented, and legal protections against any time of discrimination would have to be strengthened, and we'll also need a cultural change in this context. Hank Greeley wrote this almost a decade ago, and it's still super relevant. Whether we view, it was D at the time because it was diagnosis, whether we view the technology gladly as a way to reduce human suffering, warily as a step towards a eugenic dystopia, or as a mix of both, we should agree that the better we prepare, the more likely we are to avoid the worst misuses of this potentially transformative technology. So this talk today was a part of what I hope will be a preparation. Thank you. We have 2 minutes, yay.
Yeah, so if there are any questions
or ideas.
And may I use my bias as a son to
Yes.
put the first question in?
Yes.
As far as the consent of the child to have this information about him released, not to be nihilistic, but I think that's not really relevant because none of us here, for no child consented to be born in the first place.
There's an identity problem.
None of us have been.
Of course.
None of us consented to be born.
Of course.
And at the moment a child is born, information, we already know information about the child that never consented to be given. A child never consented to be known whether he has blue eyes, blue hairs, or whether he's a male or a female.
So this is a well-known objection to many things, and it's definitely relevant in this context. But this leads me to mention genetic exceptionalism that Eric has worked on a lot. We tend to be more scared when it comes to exposure of our genetic information for many reasons. It's links to identity, it's links to healthcare, the potential for legal discrimination. You're right that in a way, nobody chose to be born, and at birth we know already so much about you. Family history may tell us no less than whole genome sequencing for what matters. But we have culturally and traditionally been particularly afraid of genetic exposures. We're having a whole day conference on privacy in the context of genomics and not other things. So, but this is a very fair objection.